let me just put the link there too. Second. Okay. So I think we're ready to introduce Professor Jacka. So Professor Felice Jacka is director of the Food and Mood Center at Deakin University. She is also the founder and president of the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry Research, and she's the immediate past president of the Australian Alliance for the Prevention of Mental Disorders. She has been responsible for the development of a highly innovative field of research, establishing diet and nutrition as of importance to common mental health disorders. And the results of the studies she has conducted have been highly influential, and she is widely recognized as an international leader in the nascent and transformative field of nutritional psychiatry research. So, with no further ado, I will pass the word to Professor Jacka. I hope you enjoy.
Hello everyone, it's a great pleasure to be with you today to talk about nutritional psychiatry. I'm going to give a bit of a context and a background to the field and talk about some of the work that we're doing at the Food and Mood Centre and sort of where we're headed and where the gaps are. I hope you find this of interest. I'll start with declarations and acknowledgements, of course. We get a fair amount of philanthropic funding. Of course, in Australia now we have a great deal of trouble getting research funding, so we're often reliant on philanthropy. We're starting to move towards, though, generating the data that will give us access to some much more large-scale grant applications, and we have a couple of large-scale projects underway as well. Of course, the context for this is the global burden of disease, with mental and substance use disorders accounting for the leading burden of global disability, particularly depression and anxiety, these what we call the common mental disorders. And when we think about mental disorders, many of the risk factors, so family history and genetics, early life trauma, life stress, poverty and disadvantage, these are all very difficult to modify. They're not impossible, but of course there's a lack of political will a lot of the time, but they're very complex, challenging factors to modify. So identification of modifiable risk factors that would influence potentially both the emergence and the trajectory of mental disorders, of course, is incredibly valuable. And in that sense, understanding that the quality of our diets and our physical activity contribute risk and can be modified to treat mental disorders is incredibly powerful. And this is where the space in which we're operating. Obviously, there are still gaps in our knowledge, and as I said, I'll talk about what we know so far and where we're going with this. But simply speaking, the fact that these are modifiable, something that people have control over themselves as well, although I would say this should not always be around the individual. It should be about systemic changes and changing the environment to support people to have better health behaviours. It's a very powerful understanding. And alongside of that, of course, is the knowledge that the quality of our diets and, well, poor diet quality is actually now the leading cause of illness and early death across the world. This obesogenic environment and the predominance of ultra-processed food products across the world in our industrialised food system is now accounting for something like $12 trillion a year in cost to the planet, and that's including environmental costs, but also to human health. So again, the understanding that this leading cause of illness and environmental destruction is linked to the leading cause of global disability gives us fantastic opportunities to think about both prevention, public health policy, and of course treatment. This is just, again, going back to this knowledge that poor diet is the leading global burden of disease. And of course it influences disease through increasing the risk for chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes and high blood pressure, etc., etc. But the knowledge that it also influences mental disorders is relatively new. And indeed, the field really only emerged roughly 10 or more years ago. This was my boast slide, I guess. This was my PhD. It was published on the front cover of the American Journal of Psychiatry, which seems kind of quaint now, given it was a cross-sectional observational study, but it was the first study to actually look at the quality of people's diets and clinically assessed depressive and anxiety disorders, of course taking into account all those other factors we need to take into account, such as income and education and other health behaviours, body weight, etc. But showing these relationships between the quality of people's diets and the likelihood of them having a clinically depressive or an anxiety disorder. And since then, many, many other studies have been done from right across the world, you know, from places as diverse as India and China and Japan and Canada, and many, many studies. And again, largely they take into account all of those other potentially confounding factors, which is really important, but certainly have moved away from cross-sectional to focus on prospective studies where we can actually look at risk, taking into account people's mental health start, or identifying those who have no mental health problems and looking at the emergence of incident depression in particular. And I should say that most of the data so far are in depression, some small data in anxiety disorders, but it just has not been looked at as frequently. This is a bit of a busy slide, I'm afraid, but this is just one of the many different meta-analyses on the topic now. And overall, and of course you can assess diet in many different ways. You have these a priori diet quality scores, you have dietary pattern analysis, you have dietary inflammatory indices. These are all different ways of trying to capture this very, very complex construct. And whichever way we look at it, we find that people who have a healthier diet, it's associated with a reduced risk of about 30% for depression. Very importantly, this is true right across the life course. So cognizant that half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14, identification of early life factors that can be modified to actually prevent some cases of illness is really critical. I was the president of the Alliance for the Prevention of Mental Disorders in Australia, and prevention is really at the heart of a lot of my thinking and a lot of the work that I do, because prevention is always better than treatment. So in that regard, the fact that there are many, many studies showing this quite clear link between the quality of young people's diets and their mental health is really key. You know, you see the emergence of particularly depression around puberty in young people. This is a key time, and it's also a key time when their diets are often very poor as they're moving from the family home to have some autonomy about the food that they eat. This is one of the first studies I led many years ago now, where we looked at more than 7,000 quite young adolescents from right across Australia, a very wide range of backgrounds. We're able to take into account a whole host of factors, including family SES, but also poor family management and conflict, all these familial things. And you can see these very clear links between those with the lowest intake of healthy foods having the highest mental health scores, depression scores. This is on the SMFQ. Similarly, the highest intake of unhealthy foods, the junk and processed foods. These were also associated with a higher depressive load. But key to understand, and we see this again and again in the literature, is these are not the same people. So both not having enough of the good stuff and or having enough of the bad stuff, it seems to be problematic. And we see this across the life course. And if you think about it, you'll know probably yourself, quite a lot of young people who are eating really good food at home, they're having lots of vegetables and good quality food. But then before, during, after school with their friends, they're going and they're hanging out at fast food restaurants, they're having a lot of these other junk and processed foods. This seems to be a problem, even though they're getting the good foods. By the same token, you can see quite often, and this often is observable in older people, where they're not necessarily going and hanging out at McDonald's and eating lots and lots of these processed foods and junk foods, but they're also having a very limited diet, lots of white foods, not much variety, not much in the way of high quality, high fibre foods. And again, that seems to be problematic. So this is just a snapshot. There are, again, many, many studies out there. But this just to give you a sense that this is true right at the beginning of life. And, you know, the point is that the diet of children around the world is really appalling. In Australia, less than 0.5% of children reach the vegetable and legume intake recommendations. And these are, of course, the absolutely key sources of dietary fibre and polyphenols and things that we know we need for our gut health. Australian teenagers have on average 7 serves of junk food a day. So that's probably pretty similar in the US and the UK, etc. And of course, as well as that being a problem in itself, it pushes out other healthful foods. In America, 60% of children alive today will be clinically obese by the time they're 35. Now, this is a massive issue because we're talking about the primary years for reproduction and the intergenerational transmission of illness. And it's really important to understand that there's a very consistent link between the quality of what people eat during pregnancy, what women eat, and children's early life diet and the trajectory of emotional dysregulation and, you know, the measures that we use in early life to identify risk for mental health problems, such as internalising and externalising. So this is a study I led back in 2013 from the very, very large MOBA study in Norway. We had data from roughly 30,000, from memory, mothers and their children. And what we did was we modelled the trajectory of internalising and externalising across the first few years of life as a function of mum's diets during pregnancy, children's diets in the first few years. And we saw these relationships. Mums who had higher intakes of junk and processed foods, the kids had higher levels of particularly externalising behaviours, anger and aggression type behaviours. And importantly, of course, we took into account as much as possible, and this is a very good cohort study with many, many variables, all of these other factors that we identified could have been linked to both dietary intake and children's behaviours. But then independently, the children's diets were also linked to their internalising and externalising behaviours. And both, again, a lower intake of the healthy foods and a higher intake of the unhealthy foods, both linked to higher internalising and externalising behaviours. Now, since then, there's been many, many other studies done, and this is a nice meta-analysis led by close colleagues of ours, where they looked at just mothers' diets during pregnancy, not early life diet, but we see that in cognition, externalising, and socio-emotional outcomes, you see this small but statistically significant association with various measures of child neurodevelopment. Wasn't significant for internalising, and you see a lot of variation in the data here, and who knows, there are many things that contribute to these types of outcomes, and this is a key message, I think, particularly for parents and for mothers who always feel they get landed with all the blame for anything that goes wrong with children, is that it's not, if you have a terrible diet during pregnancy, that doesn't mean that your child is destined to have a terrible mental disorder or anything else. But what it's saying is at the population level, if you're talking about an exposure like diet that affects 100% of the population every day, and that it does have some sort of bearing on risk, and that you can modify it, that's very powerful understanding. There are many methodological challenges with measuring diet, and of course there are many very closely interacting factors that make nutritional epidemiology very famously complex, and I can talk about those methodological things forever, but one thing I would say is that in the Food and Mood Centre, unlike a lot of other centres where this is discussed a lot but it doesn't seem to happen, we pre-register all of our epidemiological studies now and have done for at least the last 2 years, and so have a very clear statistical plan and a publishing plan so that we really avoid that issue of data fishing, which is, obviously repugnant and affects some studies. We also are increasingly focusing on a causal modelling framework and making sure that we do detailed directed acyclic graphs beforehand, etc., etc. So there's many things that we're doing to try and make sure that the work that we do is as robust as possible. But I think that this is a really interesting area, and I'll talk a bit in a moment about some of the work that we're doing. Sorry, having some issues with my computer. I'll stop it really. Anyway, this is another study that we've actually just published with the group in Norway again, where we looked at maternal diet and child ADHD. So we looked at both symptoms and we looked at diagnoses from the registry. And what we have here, the PDQI, is a measure of healthy diet quality during pregnancy in mothers. The UPFI is a measure of ultra-processed food intake. So that's kind of the other side of it, healthy food, the unhealthy food, and then the CDQI is the Child Diet Quality Index. And you can see those crude and adjusted relationships that are fairly consistent, where higher diet quality in pregnancy is associated with lower symptom level in the children. And in study, I think we had about 70,000 children, mothers and children, whereas ultra-processed food intake was had an opposite sort of association, and then the child's diet was also related to their symptom levels. And this is looking at the diagnoses, the outcome, and you'll see these similar patterns of association, not always significant, but similar patterns of association. And this is really interesting to me because our understanding, I think, had been very much that ADHD is very much a genetic condition. But this suggests that maybe there's some factors during pregnancy and in early life that might be able to in some way modify outcomes in relation to ADHD. It's not just mums though. We shouldn't just blame mums. This is another study from the Very Large MOBA study, and in this I think they had data from virtually the whole cohort, which is roughly 100,000 people. And if we go back to this idea or this knowledge that 60% of children alive today will be clinically obese during their prime child-rearing years, and that metabolic health is so clearly linked to child outcomes, health outcomes, all sorts of health outcomes. It's not just the mums. This is in dads. You can see these relationships between the father's BMI and the risk for Asperger's and autism spectrum disorders. And again, these take into account a wide range of potentially confounding factors. How this is working, we still are unclear, but we're starting to do a lot of work to try and understand that. Epigenetics is likely involved as far as the fathers go, we believe, and with the mothers, we're very much focused on the gut microbiome during pregnancy and early life. Now, of course, it's one thing to have all of these observational data, but we know correlation doesn't equal causation, and no matter how rigorously you apply a causal modelling framework and you adjust for everything that you think of and blah, 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 you really need interventions to demonstrate some sort of causality. These are incredibly difficult in lifestyle medicine because, of course, you can't blind people to the nature of the condition, the diet that they're in. But we gave this a good go, and this is the first randomised controlled trial that I attempted. I was an early postdoc. I think I wrote the protocol for this in the first year out of my PhD, and everyone thought I was bananas, as they did when I started my PhD in the first place. They all thought I was bonkers. But managed to get some funding for it, not a huge amount, but some funding. And after 3 very long years of trying to recruit people, it was a very difficult trial to recruit for. And I think that's because certainly no one referred patients to us. Psychiatrists thought, what a silly idea. Patients thought, well, I'm really, really sick. Oh, how is this going to help? But basically what we did, we recruited people with moderate to severe major depressive disorder, and we randomly assigned them to receive either dietary support from a clinical dietitian over a 3-month period or social support, which we know is really helpful for people with depression over a 3-month period. We did blinded as much as possible, certainly the assessors, and we, as I said, did our best over 3 years in a little room with a leaky ceiling and moulded carpet, and no money, and anyway, we managed to do it, and it's actually been a very, very impactful trial. So this was the outcome, and I can tell you that we were just as surprised as everyone else to see these outcomes, because we saw a huge effect size. Even though we had a small sample size, we saw that in those who received the dietary intervention, roughly a third of them went on to have full remission of their symptoms compared to the social support condition, where you always see an improvement in depression trials, sort of this regression to the mean, placebo, et cetera, but you can see that there was a far greater improvement in the dietary group. I think what made me feel that this was a causal relationship was, A, we saw similar associations with a whole host of secondary outcomes, including anxiety, but because there was such a tight relationship between the degree to how much people improve their diet and the degree to which their depressive symptoms improved. And you can see these measures of adherence to the diet. What we also did was we looked at this because, of course, any diet that you give people or dietary recommendations, they have to be affordable, they have to be feasible. And so what we did was a very detailed cost analysis, and we found that actually the diet that we were recommending was cheaper than the junk food heavy diet that people were eating when they came into the study. And our recommendations were not, these very, very, very fancy fresh fish and beautiful extra virgin olive oil and nuts and artisan sourdough breads and everything else, which are, of course, really, really expensive. But rather they were much more simple, feasible, affordable approaches. And you can see here just some of the types of recommendations, tinned fish, tinned beans, salad, things in a can, frozen vegetables. These are all affordable, accessible, and very simple and easy to prepare. And as we saw, people did change their diet. They loved it. It was something that they could do for themselves, and it resulted in some very, very good outcomes. What we also did was a formal economic evaluation, and what we found was that there was a roughly $2,500 cost saving per participant for those in the dietary group, even when we took into account the cost of the dietitian and the diet. And that's because they lost less time out of role and they saw other health practitioners less often. So what this is suggesting is it's having a global benefit to people, to their functioning and to their daily life. So this was very encouraging. Now, there's been about 3 other studies since then in larger sample sizes of people, with depression and having a dietary intervention to attempt to improve their depression. All of these studies have shown positive outcomes. There's another one that did an economic evaluation, found very similar to what we did, that it was highly cost effective. However, we still need many more trials, and there are many aspects to the way we go about testing this hypothesis that are challenging, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But what we did do is we did a big meta-analysis where we looked at the interventions where they had intervened to change diet for some other outcome. So the focus might have been cardiometabolic, etc. But where they happened to have also assessed depression and in some cases anxiety. And when we crunch the numbers, we can see from 16 RCTs with more than 45,000 participants that dietary interventions significantly reduced depressive symptoms. We didn't see an effect for anxiety. There were far fewer studies, but what we did see was that there was an effect for anxiety in the studies where a dietitian or a proper nutrition professional delivered the intervention, and this is something we've seen before. There's a very different thing between an RA or someone just giving some dietary recommendations and a dietitian or professional who knows not just what to eat, but how to help people make those changes. And that's a really key point. We saw greater benefits in females, and we don't know quite why that is, but, we need to do more research. So at this stage, and I haven't mentioned all of the animal literature, I'll just touch on a couple of bits about that in a moment, but we can say diet seems to matter to mental and brain health, and this seems to be true right across the life course. I haven't talked about the end-of-life stuff, but there are many data also in older people, and incident depression in old age, which is quite common. As I said, diet's modifiable, so it's a really key target for both prevention and treatment. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about the work we're doing at the Food and Mood Centre. Centre's it's not even 5 years old yet, and of course it's had a COVID pandemic, and I've had breast cancer twice, so I've been out of action for a little while, but we still have grown to be nearly, I think we're about 40 people now doing a lot of studies. Some of them are well funded, some of them are more proof of concept and generating pilot data, but I'll talk about some of them. Some of the studies we're doing, I think we're doing over 20 different studies. Many of them were on hold because of COVID, so next year we'll have more data coming out. But this is a really key image. I guess it gives you a sense of what we do because it's very, very broad. We look right across the age range. We look at basic mechanisms right through to large population health interventions, policy, education and training. We look at not just, we're moving away from just looking at depression and anxiety, but extending into psychotic disorders, eating disorders, PTSD. We're looking at cognition, neurobiology. We're interested in multiple sclerosis, chronic fatigue syndrome. There's lots of things that we're doing, and of course comorbidities and physical health as well. And I'm personally very interested in health economics, because that then feeds into policy recommendations. I'm going to touch on this. This is a terrific review paper that Wolf Marks in my group led just recently. This was published in MolPsych, and it touches on all the different mechanisms, the different ways in which the data suggests diet might influence mental and brain health. And so you have, of course, neurogenesis, you have inflammation and oxidative stress. This is a really key aspect of the diet mental health relationship. Epigenetic changes, stress response system, the tryptophan-kynurenine metabolism, mitochondrial dysfunction is one that we're very interested in. And then there's the gut microbiota, and the key thing about the gut microbiota is that it tends to link to everything else. In regards to brain plasticity, I thought it's worth touching on this because this is very interesting. One of the things that got me interested in this field in the first place was in the early 2000s, the increasing science coming out of particularly UCLA looking at the impact of dietary change on the hippocampus, and it had only been recently recognised that the hippocampus is plastic. It actually, it grows and shrinks, and there are really important proteins such as BDNF that help with this neurogenesis and this growth of new neurons. The hippocampus is key to learning and memory, but it's also very involved in mental health. So these animal studies were saying, okay, you can modify diet as well as exercise, and you can affect both the size and the functioning of the hippocampus and the neurotrophins that are involved in this neurogenesis. So I wanted to test whether this was also true in humans. And this was from a large cohort study in Australia that I'd already done some work in, where we'd shown that the quality of people's diets was related to their incident depression in older age. And it was a study where we had very, very good data on things such as socioeconomic disadvantage and life stress and all sorts of things, so that we were able to take it into account. But we also had MRI data on a subgroup of about 250 of these older people, where we'd measured, the people running the study had measured hippocampal volume. So it was actually a wonderful opportunity to then go and say, okay, we've done the dietary analyses, we understand the quality of people's diets, we know a lot about their history of depression, their social situations, all these other factors that could influence this potential link between the diet quality and hippocampal volume. Let's see what we find. And I won't go into huge detail. It was a prospective study, and this is at the baseline measure, people's hippocampal volume. This is 4 years later, and what this is basically saying is what we know, as you get older, your hippocampus shrinks, and this is where you start losing your kids and forgetting your kids' names and that sort of stuff. It's really depressing. But in this particular study, we saw that the quality of people's diets was linked to their hippocampal volume, and it wasn't a small effect size. This was equivalent to about 60% of that age-related shrinkage in the hippocampus. Now, since then, there's been two other much larger studies. Tasneem Akbarali looked at this in the large Whitehall 2 cohort study, and then there's another big study from, I think, the Netherlands that has also shown this link between diet quality and hippocampal volume. So it seems that what is true in animals also seems to be true in humans. And of course, again, going back to the microbiota gut-brain axis, which is an increasing area of interest for many, many people. It's, I guess, analogous to the discovery of ultra-small particles in physics at the beginning of last century. But this understanding that these bacteria that we have co-evolved with seem to be involved in virtually every aspect of our health, our body and brain's functioning, is really quite powerful. Apart from anything else, you can sample these really quite readily. What the samples mean, what they tell us is another story that's far more complex. But what we know about the gut microbiota so far, the human gut microbiota, is that many things influence it. Where we live, whether we're in a rural area or urban settings, whether we're exposed to animals, drugs we take, born, our age is a very big one, exercise, breastfeeding, all of these aspects affect our gut microbiome from what we know so far. Diet seems to be one of the most, if not the most important, and it modifies the bacteria and their function very, very quickly. And as such, of course, this is a key area of interest to us because, as I said, the gut microbiome links to all of those other things that I touched on, tryptophan metabolism, everything, mitochondrial function, HPA axis function, and certainly the immune system. Something like 70% of your immune function is actually kind of resides in your gut. So the primary role of our gut bacteria is basically to break down components of food that our human enzymes can't break down. And that is primarily plant fibers and polyphenols that are also found in plants. And in breaking down these dietary components, they produce many, many different molecules. And those molecules have a multitude of effects throughout the body and the brain. Some of these molecules are certainly short-chain fatty acids are things that we're very interested in, but, they even synthesize vitamins and they do many, many different things. So I won't go into that because I will never finish if I do that, but they certainly seem to have an influence, as I said, on all of these other factors that we think are involved in this diet, mental brain health pathway. So we have a very extensive microbiome research program. One of the things we do is really focused on quality and ensuring world-class standards. Dr. Amy Loughman in our group set up the Australasian Human Microbiome Research Network, which is very active and is doing a lot of very interesting things. We're very interested in the infant microbiome and neurodevelopment, the oral microbiome and brain health. Amy's leading this area, looking at its potential role in cognition and Alzheimer's disease. And then, of course, we're doing a lot of clinical trials and epidemiology in a whole host of disorders where we're collecting samples. And this, of course, is really important because it's one thing to run trials and show some sort of an effect, but if you don't know how that's happening, then it doesn't allow you to kind of refine your approach and target in and develop more personalised approaches to treatment. One of the things we're very interested in and where we have some new data is on early life. Because of all of those data I showed you about mothers' diets during pregnancy being related to children's mental, emotional regulation outcomes and also children's diets in the early years, the knowledge that we're getting now, and it has to be said, a lot of it is coming from animal studies, so we have to be cautious, but it does suggest that mothers' diets, of course, influence their own gut microbiome, but what the mother's microbiome is doing during pregnancy seems to be potentially influencing some aspects of neurodevelopment in the fetus. And then in infancy, we know that the early life infant microbiome helps to train their immune system. So it's very important in immune system development. But increasingly, we think that it's also related to brain development in those very early stages. So obviously, optimising that is really important. Optimising mum's diet for her own mental health, for the children's mental health, but also so that her microbiome is a happy one and that the infants start off on the right footing. And you can just then for a second think about the impact of caesarean sections, antibiotic exposure during pregnancy and delivery, and what we might be seeing in the world in relation to massively increased rates of allergic diseases and autoimmune diseases, etc. Anyway, these are just some key publications that you may be interested in, and I'll talk briefly about some of these. In this paper, so Sam Dawson in our group led a paper in the large Barwon infant cohort study, which is roughly 1,000 mothers and infants followed in great detail, and they have pregnancy dietary data and microbiome data. And what she found was that the alpha diversity of the mother's microbiota, which is not always, but often seems to be an indicator of a healthy microbiome, because if you think diversity and a more even spread of bacteria, it's a bit like having a healthy ecosystem, a healthy rainforest. It seems to be associated with better cancer outcomes, better frailty outcomes, a whole host of things. And in this study, what they saw is that in infants, mothers who had a more diverse gut, their children, their infants, had reduced problem behaviours at age 2. And what we saw was that there wasn't a direct effect between the mother's diets and the infant's behaviours, but there was this indirect effect. So the healthy diet of the mum was linked to higher alpha diversity, which was linked to better behavioural outcomes. So that's very cool. And then another study led by Amy Loughman, the head of our microbiome research stream in the centre, in the same cohort, looked at the infant's microbiome composition and internalising, externalising behaviours at 2. And what they found was that in infants at 1, those who had the presence or a higher abundance of this Prevotella bacteria were much less likely to have problem behaviours at 2. Prevotella is a very interesting bacteria. It's linked to dietary fibre intake. So that's another really interesting piece of the puzzle. So, of course, what we wanted to know is, can we target diet quality during pregnancy to improve the gut microbiota of mums and infants? So we undertook a small randomised control trial at our large Royal Children's Hospital with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. This is the protocol if you're interested. And what we did was we randomly assigned women during pregnancy at about week 26, and we only had a small sample, unfortunately, only about 45 participants because no funding. But we randomly assigned them to receive either a dietary workshop and a couple of support phone calls afterwards versus standard care, which is supposed to include some nutrition recommendations, but it doesn't, as we found out. So the dietary workshop basically focused on increasing the intake of prebiotic foods and probiotic foods. So prebiotic foods being the high fibre foods, the legumes, the onions and whole grain cereals, etc. Probiotic foods being things like yogurt, kimchi and sauerkraut and fermented foods. And what we saw was that taking this approach, when you think about dietary recommendations, they're often focusing on obesity. This is really problematic. For a start, in all of the work that we've done, we do not see that body weight plays any role in this diet-mental health relationship, which seems very counterintuitive. But just as an example, from the SMILES trial, the average BMI of participants in the SMILES trial was 30. That did not change. They did not lose weight, but yet they had a really massive improvement in their mental health. All the epidemiological data, we take body size into account, does not explain the relationships that we see. If you focus your messaging around diet on body weight, you are doomed to fail, because body weight is complex, it's a systemic environmental condition, it has a massive genetic component to it, and most people can't lose weight, or if they do, they can't keep it off. So people give up. But if you make your messaging very concrete and proximal, and you say, when you eat this thing, it goes in, your gut bacteria will get it within an hour or two, and it will start doing all these things in your body, that's very concrete. And that's what we thought would change behaviour. And this is what we found. It really did. So it improved total diet quality, it improved dietary variety, it improved the intake of prebiotics and probiotic foods. And what we found, and this isn't published yet, but our primary outcome was actually the alpha diversity of the infant gut microbiota. And what we found is that there is a difference in the infant gut microbiota alpha diversity in those whose mums did get the intervention versus those who didn't. We don't know what it means, but it's a really important proof of concept that we can intervene to improve mums' diets, and that seems to have some bearing on the infant microbiome. Fermented foods themselves are hugely interesting to us. So Hajral Aslam and our team led quite a fascinating review on the potential of fermented foods to have an influence on mental and brain health, and some of the very early work that's already been done in this area. Because, you know, when you get these fermented foods, it's virtually like doing what your gut does, but outside of your gut. And the fermentation products that are produced, I mean, they produce neurotransmitters, all of these products that have anti-inflammatory effects. And so in themselves, we are very, very interested in their potential in mental and brain health. And we're actually, I'll go back to that in a second, we're just about to start a trial where we're looking at, we've worked with a company who's designed for us a placebo a fermented dairy product versus a real fermented dairy product. So the placebo one has none of the fermentation products, none of the bacteria, etc., but it should taste and feel like the same thing. 40 women for 8 weeks randomly assigned to placebo or fermented dairy, doing MRI, mass spec, looking at a whole host of brain endpoints as well as cognitive endpoints, blood biomarkers, and of course stool samples as well. We'll use metagenomics to look at those. What I think is really interesting, I'll just point to this paper. It was only a small study, but it's an intervention that's just been published in Cell. And it's really interesting because it was done in Americans who have a terrible, terrible diet. You would know that SAD stands for Standard American Diet, very, very low fibre and very high processed food intake. And so what they did was they assigned people to receive either a high fibre diet for 6 weeks or a high fermented foods diet. A high fibre group didn't increase their fermented foods, and the high fermented foods diet didn't increase their fibre. They were interested in the impact on gut microbiota diversity, but also inflammatory markers. And I think what they found surprised them a little bit. They found that the high fermented food diet really did increase microbial diversity. And these weren't the microbes that were in the fermented foods. They were the microbes that were already in people's guts, but they made them more, like the ones that were barely present, to grow more. So you had more even spread, you had more bugs present. That's a very lay way of explaining it. But they also saw decreased inflammatory signals and activity in that group. But in the high fibre group, you've got a much more mixed picture, which is so interesting, and it really backs up a lot of other interesting things that have been coming out of the literature. People who had low microbial diversity to start with, they actually ended up with increased inflammatory markers. If they had moderate or higher microbiota diversity, you can see that the immune responses were positive. But those who started off with what we would call a pretty crappy gut, they had worse outcomes in terms of their immune response. And they thought, well, hang on, maybe that's because if you feed fibre to people who are just not used to eating fibre, and they don't have the bacteria to break it down, what happens? You've got undigested fibre sitting in the gut and, of course, promoting an inflammatory response. And that's the evidence they saw for that, of some undigested fibre in the gut. So I thought that was a really nice small study. We're actually doing an FMT study. We've been working on this for a long time. Of course, it's been complex because the equivalent to the FDA in Australia has stepped in and said we're going to regulate FMT, but we're working with a couple of big, very good stool banks now. And this has been affected by COVID, but will start very, very soon, which is a pilot study of FMT in people with major depressive disorder. FMT being fecal microbial transplant, so essentially a poo transplant. And I won't go into all of the research behind that, but I do say watch this space because we're hoping that this will form the basis of a far larger trial. We're doing a lot of other dietary interventions. This one is a small study where we look at people with IBS, who of course very often have comorbid anxiety, depression, and we're looking at whether a Mediterranean diet can help to improve depressive symptoms and what are the outcomes related to gut health and gut safety and that sort of thing. We're doing another pilot study in Finland of a ketogenic diet in people with psychosis. Again, getting pilot data for hopefully much larger trials. This ketogenic diet has been designed by Dr. Anu Rusanen, and it focuses on poly and monounsaturated fats and plant foods rather than the saturated fat. You can see a bit more about that there. So that's underway, and we're trying to get funding for pilot data for a ketogenic trial in bipolar disorder. There's some reasons to think that a ketogenic diet might be helpful in these serious mental conditions. Certainly don't recommend it as a general diet. It's very hard to adhere to. It's generally very hard on the planet. It can have some really nasty cardiometabolic effects. And of course, it's the opposite of a gut-friendly diet because it's low in fibre and high in fat. But in disorders where we see dysregulation of glucose metabolism like schizophrenia and dysregulation of mitochondrial function such as bipolar disorder, we think that it may be certainly worth testing. And this is the whole point. You can intervene and change diet and change these endpoints very quickly. This is a very famous study where people were randomly assigned to get either a very plant-based diet or an animal-based diet just for 5 days. And it had a pretty pronounced impact on their gut and their metabolites very, very quickly. And this is really the key point for us, is that you can change your diet and change your gut and have some impact on mental health pretty quickly. This is what we see in the data emerging, although of course we need more studies, but this is another nice dietary intervention led by colleagues of ours. It was a 3-week intervention where they supported young people. It was a very simple trial to increase fruits and vegetable consumption basically and legumes. They tested increases in carotenoids using a spectrophotometer, so they confirmed that people did actually improve their diet. And then those that had the dietary change, they had a really nice reduction in their depressive symptoms. And again, that was just in 3 weeks. So this is the power, I think, is that people can get a change very quickly and that motivates them. So the benefits of a lifestyle approach, I don't think I need to tell you about the importance of looking after the physical health of people with mental disorders. People with mental disorders live on average 15 to 20 years shorter lifespan than people without. This is the Big Lancet Psychiatry Commission report that really threw this into focus a couple of years ago. It's really unacceptable that people living with mental disorders have these outcomes, and it's largely to do with the fact that in clinical care this is focus on the brain, this focus on symptoms in the brain and not on the body, as if they're somehow separate, as you can see in this. And this is, I think, the paradigm of psychiatry for a very long time, but that is now changing. So, and I like to claim some credit for this because we've been very active in advocacy and policy recommendations, but in our very large National Productivity Commission mental health report last year, for the first time, poor nutrition as well as limited physical exercise, sleep and drug use have now been listed as individual level risk factors and treatment targets for mental disorders across the life course. So that's a really good start. What's even more exciting is that our Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatry clinical guidelines for the treatment of mood disorders for the first time now has put what is essentially lifestyle medicine as the foundation of treatment to do before anything else. They say it's non-negotiable. So achieving a healthy diet, regular exercise, sleep hygiene, as well as substance use cessation before you move on to other things. And we were invited to write a commentary on this if anyone's interested. That's the citation. And our commentary was roundly endorsed by the RANZCP. So I think that these are the first clinical guidelines in the world, but I don't think they'll be the last. What we need now are these large-scale effectiveness trials, partly to do with the fact that it's very challenging to blind people to their condition, and so you need these real-life trials that, okay, does this work in the real world? But it's also to generate data that can inform changes to our health system. So this is a large-scale trial that we have proper funding for that's underway at the moment, and it's a very quick, punchy trial. We've only had 18 months to do this. But basically what we're doing is a non-inferiority trial. People coming through our hospitals' mental health services are randomly assigned to get either psychotherapy, group-based telehealth psychotherapy, which is their treatment as usual, if you like, compared to, or to our calm intervention, which is delivered by exercise physiologists and clinical dietitians, again, group-based, exactly matched in every single way, same duration. And what we want to know is lifestyle support at least as effective as psychotherapy support, a CBT, and is it cost effective? And this, of course, will allow us to generate data that will inform, hopefully, health policy reform, workforce training needs, etc., so that we can promote integration into clinical care. Because it's one thing to make clinical recommendations and guidelines, but if there's this huge training gap, and for example, psychiatrists, like all medical practitioners, have about 2 hours of nutrition training, for example, through their whole training, we need to address that gap. We're working on we set up an international task force developing lifestyle medicine guidelines, clinical guidelines for lifestyle medicine for the management of mental health problems. The first one focuses on depression, and that's due for release in 2021. This is the task force to date. Some of you may know some of these people: Ted Danan, Brendan Stubbs. It's been co-chaired by Adrian O'Neill in our centre, Associate Professor Adrian O'Neill, Wolf Marks, one of my lead postdocs. So that should be released next year. But then also we are going to extend this CALM trial nationally, and we're going to do it in primary care through our new National Mental Health Clinical Trial Network, which involves all of these different players from the healthcare system, private and public, as well as research, etc. So we're going to be able to take everything we've learned from the CALM trial and say, okay, in primary care, when people come in with mental disorders in primary care, can we test this normal treatment versus this lifestyle care and figure out how to best deliver this? Is it cost effective? And of course, first and foremost, is it effective? We also need to work on this education and training gap. We initiated this Food and Mood free online course at the end of 2019. It is so far, I think it was number 11 in the world last year in free online courses. It's seen over 70,000 people from more than 170 countries going through it, which I think speaks to the interest in this particular area now. But we're also now working with the Royal Australian New Zealand College to develop accredited training, and some of those training modules and things will be available online so people around the world can access them. We're also developing accredited training for clinical services who want to overhaul their services to improve the food environment, the exercise environment, etc. So this is all underway at the moment and things that we're leading. If anyone wants to know more about this, I wrote this book 2019. That's pretty widely available. It's a little bit out of date now, but it gives us sort of a background to how nutritional psychiatry came into being, if you like. And this is one that I love. My husband and I wrote this last year, and it's designed to give kids concrete information about eating healthy food and why they should do that and how they can look after the zoo that lives in their poo. And of course, hopefully that way also inform their parents and teachers and grandparents, etc. So that was a lot of fun doing that. People who are interested, please go to the International Society for Nutritional Psychiatry research website. We've got a new ECR committee that's now saying to be really active. We're planning for our next major conference in the beginning of 2023 in Australia. There's lots of online stuff you can get involved with. We would love to see more people joining up. And there are my acknowledgements and thank yous. We've got a number of PhD students, of course, many more coming on next year, lots and lots of different postdocs. Deputy Director, Associate Professor Adrian O'Neill, who really leads our implementation and translation health services stream. And yeah, I've only mentioned a small part of the things that we're doing. So we're busy, we're doing lots of good stuff, and we'll be generating many data publications next year with any luck, now that hopefully COVID can get out of the way. So I hope that you found that interesting, and I know that I'll be doing a Q&A on this, I think, for some of you. So I look forward to doing that soon. So thanks very much.
Okay, everyone. This was a lovely talk by Professor Jacka. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So as a reminder, tomorrow, as Professor mentioned just now, we will have the Q&A, Meet the Speaker session at 8 a.m. UK time. So join. I know there are some questions here, so if you want to see them answered, just join then. And I would like to also say that next week we will have Dr. Javier Apfel, whom will tell us about how worms use the brain to regulate their behavior and physiology to deal with the lethal threat of hydrogen peroxide. And with this, I would like to thank all of you for your presence and see you next week.